The Harlem Renaissance is a major cultural and literary movement of the 1920s and 30s. This presentation is based on three texts: Anton Pokrivčák's American Literature of the 20th Century, Modernism and After, Arnold Weinstein's Classics of American Literature Lectures, and Emily Allen Williams' Writing the Harlem Renaissance, Revisiting the Vision. These critics will help us understand that Harlem Renaissance is both a literary flowering and a cultural response to history. We'll explore how the movement was defined, the historical and cultural conditions that gave rise to it, and its significance in American literature. By focusing on these perspectives, we'll see how the Harlem Renaissance offered a new vision of African American identity, challenged racial stereotypes, and reshaped American literature culture for generations to come. This cover image is Douglas's Song of the Towers, which symbolizes the Harlem Renaissance energy, creativity, and its negotiation between past and present. Throughout the presentation, we'll also look at other iconic images that visually capture the cultural power of the movement, pictures and portraits of the Harlem Hellfighters and jazz clubs and others. Pokrivčák defines the Harlem Renaissance as a flourishing of African American culture, particularly literature, in the 20s and 30s. While centered in Harlem, New York, it was not confined to that neighborhood. It became a national and even international movement. Pokrivčák situates it within the wider context of modernism. Writers experimented with form, voice, and identity, just as European and American modernists did. But the Harlem Renaissance had a distinctive mission. It reasserted racial pride, reclaimed cultural heritage, and gave voice to African American identity in ways that have not been visible in mainstream American literature before. For Pokrivčák, the Harlem Renaissance was both an artistic revolution and a social statement. It claimed a place for African American voices at the heart of American culture, and it challenged traditions of exclusion and silence, and declared that Black life and creativity were central to the nation's story. James Van Der Lee's photographs of Harlem life, such as this one shown here, Couple Harlem, visually embody the pride and dignity that Pokrivčák identifies as central to the Harlem Renaissance. Emily Allen Williams emphasizes the historical context of the Harlem Renaissance. It emerged after the Great Migration, when thousands of African Americans moved from the rural South to northern cities, especially Harlem in New York. World War I also shaped the movement. Black soldiers fought for democracy abroad, then demanded equality back at home. Williams highlights the importance of rejecting racist caricatures such as Minstrelly, shows where white actors wear blackface makeup to portray racial stereotypes. Writers and artists turned to themes of masking, a double identity forced on African Americans by racism, but also used creatively to critique stereotypes. Harlem itself became a symbolic capital of Black America, a place where culture, politics, and art converged. For Williams, the Harlem Renaissance was more than literature. It was a response to history, an act of resistance against racist traditions, and a reimagining of Black identity in the modern world. This picture of the 1919 Harlem Hellfighters parading illustrates Williams' point about Black soldiers returning from World War I, demanding equality and inspiring the cultural assertiveness of the Harlem Renaissance. Williams points to key themes and strategies that define Harlem Renaissance writing. One was the rejection of a purely tragic racial identity. Instead of portraying African Americans only as victims, writers emphasized individuality, resilience, and joy. Another feature was the celebration of cultural forms like jazz, folklore, and the Black vernacular. These were not marginal, they were central to the new literature. Writers created a dialogue with modernism, adopting techniques of fragmentation and experimentation, but shaping them to a distinct African American cultural vision. Williams argues that the Harlem Renaissance should be seen as both part of modernist innovation and as a movement with its own priorities, challenging racism, redefining identity, and affirming the richness of African American culture. These strategies allowed the movement to resist stereotypes and create a literature of resilience, creativity, and pride. Photographs of Harlem jazz clubs, like the Cotton Club shown here, remind us how writers borrowed rhythm, vernacular, and cultural energy from music to reshape literature. Weinstein frames the Harlem Renaissance as a literary reclamation project. For Weinstein, writers such as Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Countee Cullen, and Claude McKay brought African American experience directly into the mainstream of American culture. This was not simply an insertion of new voices, but a redefinition of what counted as American literature itself. Weinstein emphasizes that the Harlem Renaissance was not about assimilation, but about asserting difference, celebrating African American language, music, and forms of life as sources of literary creativity. Literature became an act of cultural reclamation, a way of insisting that African American identity was not marginal, but central to the American story. In this view, the Harlem Renaissance was both a break from exclusion and a bold new beginning, situating African American voices at the very heart of national literature. This portrait of Langston Hughes, published in Alan Locke's The New Negro, visually represents the new generation of writers Weinstein emphasizes, figures who brought African American experience to the center of American literature. Williams and Weinstein both stressed that the Harlem Renaissance was not just a literary event, but a social and cultural movement. Literature was connected to music, especially jazz and blues, performance, and visual art. The Renaissance unfolded in clubs, theaters, and magazines as much as in books. Politics and aesthetics were intertwined. Art was a vehicle for cultural pride and racial uplift. There were also tensions. Some writers sought elite recognition by appealing to mainstream standards, while others celebrated folk culture and everyday Black life. Williams underlines this tension as a productive one. It forced writers to negotiate between audiences, languages, and traditions. Weinstein reminds us that this made the Harlem Renaissance both an artistic and a social project. It was about creating great literature, but also about reshaping identity and claiming cultural space in a segregated nation. This photo of Marcus Garvey's parade in Harlem illustrates how the Renaissance was not only artistic, but also deeply political and social. When we bring these texts together, we see a set of key ideas. Pride, resilience, and creativity defined the Harlem Renaissance. Writers celebrated Black culture rather than hiding it, insisting on its value and richness. At the same time, the idea of masking and double identity highlighted by Williams reminds us that the movement also confronted racism directly, using art as a way to critique stereotypes. Pokrivčák situates the movement as part of modernism, with its experimentation and break from tradition, while Weinstein emphasizes its role in redefining the American literary canon itself. The Harlem Renaissance was both critique and affirmation. It exposed racism and exclusion, but it also created a literature of joy, identity, and creativity. It was transformative, giving American literature new voices and reshaping its cultural foundation. This painting, The Janitor Who Paints, embodies the critic's emphasis on resilience and creativity, turning everyday life into a statement of pride and artistic affirmation. All three critics studied here highlight the broader significance of the Harlem Renaissance. It was the first major African American literary movement, and it redefined the very idea of American literature as multicultural and diverse. Pokrivčák points us to its role within modernism, but with a distinct mission to reclaiming Black identity. Williams stresses its rejection of racism and of racist traditions, and its creation of a creative use of vernacular, music, and folklore. Weinstein emphasizes its transformative impact on the canon, moving Black voices to the center of American culture. The Renaissance also inspired later movements, from the Civil Rights era to the Black Arts movement of the 1960s. Its legacy shows the power of literature as cultural resistance and affirmation. By claiming space in literature, the Harlem Renaissance also claimed space in American identity, ensuring that African American culture would never again be silenced or excluded from the national story. Photographs of the 1963 March in Washington highlight how the Renaissance inspired later movements, linking literature to the ongoing struggle for equality. In conclusion, the Harlem Renaissance was a flowering of African American creativity, defined by critics as both artistic and cultural revolution. Pokrivčák emphasizes its role within modernism as a movement that embraced experimentation while redefining identity. Williams highlights the strategies of rejecting stereotypes, using vernacular culture, and asserting pride and resilience. Weinstein frames it as a reclamation of literature itself, moving Black voices to the very center of American identity. These perspectives show that the Harlem Renaissance was more than a movement. It was a transformation of American culture. Its legacy is profound in redefining American literature for future generations, inspiring later movements, and ensuring that African American creativity and resilience became an inseparable part of the nation's literary heritage. This collage of Harlem Renaissance writers reminds us that the movement was carried by individuals, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Colleen, and McKay, whose creativity transformed American literature.